Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to start the session. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mbaye. I work as a Principal Fragility and Resilience Officer in the African Development Bank, and I am pleased to be chairing this session today. We're going to discuss unveiling unexpected and hidden consequences of forced displacement. We do have two presenters online. We're going to start with Omar Hammoud-Gallego, who is a political and data scientist, assistant professor in public policy at Durham University. Omar will be talking about visa policies and porous borders, quasi-experimental evidence on the short and long-term effects from Peru. So Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll try and share my screen and then hopefully everything should go well. Please do let me know if you can't see it. Is everything all right? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, I will then start. So, thank you so much for having me present our research. So what I will do today is present joint work together with my colleagues, Feline Fryer at the Universidad del Pacífico in Peru, and Matthias Portner from the London School of Economics. In a nutshell, what we try and do in this study is that we try and answer what we believe is an important policy question, mainly what are the effects of policies that try to develop to deter migrants from crossing borders. First, on the likelihood that migrants will actually cross those borders, and second, on the subsequent integration of these migrants in the host countries where they end up going. And what we do is we sort of focus for this study on the case of the Venezuelan displacement crisis in Peru. All right. So what we try and do in this study is answer three specific research questions. First, we ask whether introducing visa restrictions actually deters the arrival of migrants within a context of mass displacement and porous borders. Second, we want to know if these restrictions are not effective at deterring migrants and migrants still enter those countries irregularly, how does falling into irregularity affect the economic, social, political, and psychological integration of migrants once they get there? And then finally, our third research question for this study is, if, let's assume, a government decides to introduce a regularization program to give migrants a legal right to stay in the country where they are at the moment, then can these regularization programs effectively compensate for any possible negative effects that these restrictions and therefore falling into irregularity might have had in the first place? So the way we sort of try and answer these research questions is by focusing on 5 different types of outcome variables. First, we focus on the likelihood of irregular entry of migrants, so whether they enter the country showing the documents to authorities, or they just cross through, for instance, what in South America are known as trochas, which means irregular crossing points along what tend to be very, very wide and porous borders. And then we focus on different outcomes of integration. For economic integration, we look at the likelihood of employment of migrants, the likelihood of formal employment, and the likelihood that they will send remittances back home. For social integration, we look at the enrollment of migrant children in schools. So in this case, Venezuelan children enrolled in Peruvian schools. For political integration, here we look at, this is something we're still working on, but we're looking at the enrollment in a public health insurance scheme, politically in the sense of migrants getting acquainted with the state institutions rather than with the political process. But again, it's something we're still working out how to frame exactly. And then finally, we look at psychological integration. And for that, we focus on two indicators. First, one indicator where migrants are asked whether they feel like an alien in the country or not. And a second one, a mental health indicator, reflects a question where migrants are asked whether over the last 4 weeks they have felt depressed, angry, anxious, or other types of sort of negative mental health related outcomes. So this is what we try and sort of focus on in this study. So what do we try and contribute to in terms of the academic literature, right? As it has been said in the previous panel, and of course, as many of you will know, there is indeed a lot of research on migrant integration, but it tends to be concentrated in OECD countries. So we try, first of all, to help and fill that gap in countries in the global south. Second, when it comes to studies that actually try and evaluate the effects of restrictions on visa restrictions on the likelihood that migrants will cross their borders irregularly, to my knowledge, there are only two big studies that try and do this. A study, 2016 one by Xyk and Hobel, and I recently published a similar study looking at the Venezuelan case across South America, published last month in World Development. Third, there is quite a big literature now, I think, on the development of asylum and migration policies within Latin America. And in that sort of, my co-author and I have also contributed a little bit recently. And then finally, of course, when it comes to the Venezuelan displacement crisis, a lot of work has been done on the effect of the regularization programs, specifically in Colombia, by also colleagues who are participating in this conference. And we sort of want to help and broaden the remit of the research that is done in the region. All right, so you have heard a bit about the Venezuelan case, but I usually try and give a bit of an introduction for anyone who might not be acquainted with this case. So Venezuela is a country in South America that has been governed by first Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, from Hugo Chavez since 1999 and Maduro since 2013, and especially during since the beginning of the period in which Maduro has been in power, the country has experienced severe democratic backsliding and very strong social repression. On top of that, because of economic mismanagement and corruption, the economy has shrunk by roughly 75% over the last few years, and all of this compounded with hyperinflation, which basically led to one of the biggest economic, social, and political collapses of recent times in South America. Now, unsurprisingly, this has led, out of a population of 30 million people, roughly, before the beginning of this chaos and democratic backsliding, from 30 million, it's estimated that over the last few years, around 8 million people have left the country. So we're talking about sort of a quarter of the population, more or less. And out of all of the countries to which they have moved, the overwhelming majority of Venezuelans has actually moved within Latin America, so over 6 million within Latin America, and not so many actually going northwards, crossing the Darien Gap, heading towards Central and North America. The reality is that the overwhelming majority has stayed within South America, so moving from Venezuela mostly into Colombia and then making their way downwards, as the map clearly shows. Now, in this study, we focus on the case of Peru. So why Peru? Peru is an interesting case to study because it's the second, after Colombia, is the second biggest receptor of Venezuelan migrants. So it hosts around 1.5 million. Precise numbers are difficult to know because many people still live in an irregular situation. And what makes it interesting from a sort of a policy perspective, and that's why we focus on it, is that as it was the case for many other countries across South America, and it's still the case in a few countries like Brazil and Argentina, for instance, Venezuelans could cross borders only using their ID cards, right? So everyone has an ID card, and you didn't need to have a passport in order to get into Peru as a Venezuelan citizen. Now, because of this quite unusual, let's say, policy setting, many Venezuelans were crossing regularly from Ecuador into Peru, and we're talking about thousands of individuals every single day to stay in the country. Because of the increased political backlash, the government decided to introduce quite abruptly, right? So with only 10 days between announcement and implementation, in June 2019, it decided that all Venezuelans were going to be requested to have a visa to enter the country, meaning that you need to have a passport, which in Venezuela was and is still very costly to get. So this is sort of this first policy announcement is what we're going to study, and the sudden introduction of visa restrictions. But what makes it interesting from a policy point of view is also that not even a year and a half after the introduction of these restrictions, the government actually passed a regularization program that for simplicity we'll just call the CPP. And this regularization program was one that gave Venezuelan migrants 1 and then extended to 2 years residency permit in the country. And it was fairly straightforward to apply to. If you go to the website of the Peruvian government, the website where you can apply for it is still there. Although, as it says there, the campaign has ended. It was only a temporary program. So this is the policy setting that we try and sort of analyze how has all of this affected the irregular entry of migrants and their subsequent integration. So to analyze this, we use a data set which includes a representative sample of 12,000 Venezuelans that were surveyed in Peru. This data was not collected by myself or by my colleagues, but by the National Statistical Office of Peru, and the name of the data set is probably known to many researchers attending the conference. It's called NPOVE2. It includes Venezuelans who have entered the country recently, up until March 2022, and it has a wealth of information about whether they've entered the country irregularly or not, what's their legal status, if they're employed, if they have children, if the children go to school, what's their education level, gender, age, ethnicity, state of origin, etc., etc. And the great thing about this data set is that it's publicly available, meaning that once this research will be published, then you will be able to replicate, researchers will be able to replicate this analysis fully. Now, how do we sort of try and answer our first research question? In order to do that, we conduct what's known as a regression discontinuity analysis. So what we do is that we compare those individuals who entered slightly before to those who entered slightly after the introduction of restrictions. Our general model looks like this, where basically we look at how these restrictions affected the likelihood of irregular entry, controlling for a vector of personal characteristics. We control for age, gender, ethnicity, education, state of origin, and we also include survey weights. And so what do we find? Graphically, these are the results. We find there is a big jump in people reporting having entered the country regularly following the introduction of these restrictions, again, controlling for a variety of socioeconomic individual characteristics. So whereas the likelihood of entering irregularly was only about 10%, 10 to 15% before the introduction of restrictions, that goes up to around half of all respondents, again, controlling for individual characteristics. And again, this is our regression table. So roughly, this is the effect, and it's robust to a variety of specifications. So indeed, regardless of your age, gender, ethnicity, education, etc., everyone was, all Venezuelan migrants were more likely to have entered the country irregularly. So that's the first finding that we have. Second, we want to understand how has falling into irregularity affected the integration of migrants once they get into the host country. And so in order to do that, we conduct a difference in differences analysis. Mainly what we do is that we compare those individuals who entered after the introduction of restrictions regularly, so those who happen to have a passport or happen to be eligible for some small exceptions that existed, with those who entered in the same period, but ended up entering irregularly because they didn't have a passport. And so that is sort of the first step where we try and sort of estimate the effect of irregularity on the integration of migrants. But then we thought, well, the government has actually introduced a regularization program. So what we can do is compare this first population who entered irregularly after the introduction of restrictions and stayed irregular with those who applied then for the regularization permit. And so to do this, we conduct what is known in econometric terms as a triple difference in differences. So we compare, again, just for to be absolutely clear, those individuals who entered irregularly after June 2019 and then did not apply for the regularization permits with those who did. And that, causally speaking, allows us then to understand what are the effects of this regularization on various integration outcomes. So we begin with the different diffs. So what is the effect of irregularity on the integration of migrants? And here are the first findings. What we defined is that, for instance, if we look in the middle of the table at school enrollment for the years 2020 and 2021, we find that falling into irregularity led to a decrease in school enrollment for migrant children by close to 15 percentage points compared to those who had managed to enter regularly over the same period. We also find that falling into irregularity had a negative effect on the likelihood of being enrolled in a public health insurance program. And so this is what concerns social and what we term political integration. How about psychological and economic? What we find is that the falling into irregularity has a negative effect on psychological integration, here again measured through a question where migrants are asked whether they feel like an alien in Peru or not. And depression is the mental health indicator that I mentioned earlier, so whether migrants over the last 4 weeks have felt depressed, angry, anxious, or other similar. And there we find a positive effect, meaning it has a negative, falling into irregularity has a negative effect on mental health outcomes. We don't find any effects on employment, which is understandable in a highly informal context. Just to give you a couple of numbers, Peruvians in Peru, the likelihood of working informally, the informality rate is about 80%, and that rises to 90% for Venezuelans. However, for those few Venezuelans who might have had a formal contract, that likelihood also decreases for those who entered irregularly. And then finally, and this was a bit surprising for us at the beginning, we find that there is a sharp increase in remittances for those individuals who entered irregularly, right? So not having documents whilst in the country means that you're more likely to send money back home instead of compared to those who actually have the legal permit to stay there. And we have a few working hypotheses of why this is the case. Now, these are the effects for falling into irregularity. But what about if we compare these individuals with those who decided to regularize? What are the effects of the regularization program, again, over the short to medium term, because we're talking about cross-sectional data on the integration of migrants? These are the results. We don't find any immediate effects on the enrollment of children in schools, which is quite concerning, meaning once you as a Venezuelan migrant enter irregularly and you're less likely to send children to school, if you regularize, at least over the short to medium term, that doesn't seem to lead to necessarily to an increase in the enrollment of children, which again is extremely concerning. And second, though, we find a sharp increase in enrollment in public health insurance schemes, which we argue is probably the main reason why many individuals would want to regularize in the first place. However, when we look at the other indicators of psychological and economic integration, we don't find much, which again is quite concerning. It might be the case that indeed, we are, even with, actually these findings hold even if we look only at Venezuelans who have been in the country for over 6 months and for over a year. So unfortunately, at least these findings seems to suggest that the regularization permit per se, at least how it was designed in Peru, it was not very effective at subsequently integrating migrants and compensating for the negative effects that these restrictions had in the first place. As in all studies of this kind, we have a battery of robustness tests. I won't go into detail. Suffice to say, our findings seem to be robust to a variety of robustness checks. And then again, once the article will be out, you'll be able to see those. I will not focus on this because they can be quite technical. But let me be honest and talk about the limitations of this study. And I think there are 3 main limitations that we should consider. First, that we don't know the absolute numbers of migrants who decided, for instance, to stop in transit countries because of the introduction of restrictions, right? So we don't know how many of them decided to stay in Ecuador or to stay in Colombia because of the introduction of restrictions. However, we do know that when Peru and then subsequently Chile and Ecuador introduced restrictions of this sort, actually we didn't see, if you look at the number of official entries in countries like Brazil and Uruguay, because they kept their borders open, you could still enter only with your ID card. We don't see any massive increase in irregular entries, suggesting that there was no substitution effect, if you want. Second, we know that respondents who entered irregularly was less likely to report the real date of entry or their migratory status, which we believe would probably leads us to actually an underestimation of the effects of the introduction of visa restrictions. So probably the effects are higher. Although in a recent study that I published, that I mentioned earlier, the magnitude of the effects that I find are roughly similar. And then finally, of course, it could very much be the case.
5 more minutes, Omar. Yeah.
Yes. It could be the case that officials knew that these policies would be unsuccessful, but implemented them anyway due to pressure from public opinion. All right, so I'll conclude here. What did we find? We find that introducing visa restrictions was likely ineffective at deterring Venezuelan migrants, and instead what it did is that it shifted their mode of entry from regular to irregular. We find that falling into irregularity as a consequence of these restrictions reduced their economic, social, political, and psychological integration. And we find that subsequent regularization program, the CPP, only had a partial effect in terms of being able to compensate for the initial negative effects of falling into irregularity. So if there is a policy takeaway, is that within a context such as this, introducing of mass displacement and porous borders, introducing restrictions is likely ineffective and harmful, and that regularization is necessary, but probably per se not enough, or at least regularization as it was done in Peru. Colombia is, of course, at the moment has become almost the gold standard because it provided Venezuelans with a 10-year residency permit, and we believe that that's probably a more realistic, a better developed regularization program than, for instance, the one implemented in Peru. And finally, this part of the research is over. However, we feel like we need to understand what are the mechanisms behind the effects that we find. And so next week, through a collaboration with a great NGO called Venactiva, which is a Venezuelan-led NGO in Peru, we're going to conduct a mass survey of Venezuelans to try and understand exactly why the regularization had the restrictions first and the regularization after had such limited effects. All right, I'll conclude here. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, if you have any questions, please do let me know.
Thank you very much, Omar, and for being on time as well. I will collect the questions after the 3 presentations. So I will just jump to the second presentation by Christopher Blair, who is assistant professor in the Department of Politics at Princeton University and who will be presenting on refugee return and conflict, evidence from a natural experiment. Chris, can you hear us?
Yes, and I am just going to share my screen now. Tell me when you can see the presentation. Can you see that? No?
No, not yet.
Okay. Maybe we jump to Jonathan, and then I'll just reopen my Cisco here and give that a try.
Okay, sounds good. Jonathan, are you with us? I hope he's ready though.
Yes, I'm here, Linguère. Thank you so much.
Okay, are you fine with presenting now?
Sure,
Yeah?
that's fine. Let me
Okay,
just share my screen.
great.
You can't do the same.
Okay, so Jonathan is senior economist in the World Bank Poverty and Equity practice, and he's working on Western and Central Africa. He will be presenting on comparing internally displaced persons with those left behind, evidence from the Central African Republic. The floor is yours, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can see my screen, I take it?
Yes.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to present this work on assessing the welfare implications of forced displacement, this time using data from the Central African Republic. Just before starting, I want to flag this is joint work with Hans Hugoven and Javier Yama from the World Bank as well. But they worked in close collaboration with colleagues from JDC, from UNHCR on the data collection, and that's continued to the analytical stage as well. So very grateful to have the opportunity to present some of this work in progress. And I think it slots nicely into some of the themes that Omar was talking about. So it's great that it's sort of in this session as well. So I'm sure it won't be a surprise to people here to hear that global poverty is increasingly becoming concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected settings. This gives us sort of motivation to work on this from the poverty angle. Colleagues at the World Bank did some very simple global poverty projections for fragile and conflict-affected settings, and they find that by 2030, around 2/3 of the global poor are likely to be living in those types of settings. And so, insofar as conflict and displacement linked, and we want to address poverty, then we need to think about analysis and policy that can focus on displaced people and on IDPs. And and guiding poverty-reducing policies really requires information on people's welfare to a variety of metrics. So we need to know, what the welfare profile is like for displaced people and for IDPs if we want to generate policies that can address this problem. As has been kind of discussed throughout this conference, there's lots of reasons that make it difficult to collect and then analyze welfare data on displaced people at large, but particularly IDPs, which is what we're focusing on this paper. And there's sort of 4 kind of buckets of reasons why this is difficult. Firstly, sampling and fieldwork logistics are far from straightforward when working with displaced populations. Displaced people are moving. They may live in locations like camps that are missed by traditional household surveys, especially as camps appear and sort of disappear very quickly sometimes. And then outside of official camps, finding displaced people in regular communities is also difficult. Well, of course, in the background, conflict hampers data collection. I think the expert group.
Jonathan, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So interpretation is asking us to tell you to slow down a bit.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
So the expert group on refugee and internally displaced persons, or INCRIS, has assembled lots of sort of logistical considerations and guidelines for collecting data in conflict-affected settings. So that's kind of the first bucket. The second bucket is, standard questionnaires need to be tailored to reflect the experiences of IDPs. Standard measures of monetary income or monetary consumption may be distorted if displaced populations rely on humanitarian assistance within camps or even outside of camps. And markets for food and non-food items may kind of also be distorted and may not be typical for those that live in official IDP and refugee camps as well. And IDPs are also extremely heterogeneous. As the third point, IDPs' experiences differ depending on whether they live in camps or other communities, the types of borders they've crossed, or their original cause of displacement. That's a little bit, I think, what Omar was looking into. We saw some of the differences there in terms of integration and the restrictions placed on migrants crossing borders. But it's this fourth bucket that we really want to focus on for this particular paper, and that's the fact that it's difficult to construct a counterfactual to really estimate the welfare effects of displacement. In fact, we sort of need to know what would have happened to IDPs had they not been displaced in the first place. And so it's this fourth bucket that we try and focus on in this particular paper. And constructing a suitable counterfactual for IDPs is difficult. What we could do as a sort of naive approach is we could simply compare displaced people and non-displaced people within a country. So you could focus on the IDPs and say, well, let's compare them to all of the people who aren't displaced in a particular country, which is very useful for policy and very useful for targeting, but it may be misleading for assessing the welfare effects of displacement, which is what we're trying to do here. So why is that? Well, firstly, the specific communities from which displaced people originate do not represent a random selection of communities across the country. IDPs or displaced people at large are typically more likely to come from areas affected by conflict, areas affected by natural disasters, or areas affected by other types of shocks. And then within those communities, there are certain types of households or individuals that may be more likely to move. So there's lots of work showing that displacement within communities depends on households' assets, on the education level of household members, and on existing networks, which determine the costs and benefits of moving when shocks strike. And in a sense, this is all related to a simpler but more provocative question, which is how much should policymakers focus on internally displaced people? So we might see that there's lots of evidence suggesting that IDPs fare worse than the rest of the population within a country. But is that because they've been displaced per se, or is that because they've come from places that were worse off to begin with? So that's the kind of provocative question we're going to look into here in this paper. So just putting out the roadmap, we'll start talking a little bit about the context and the data for the Central African Republic. I'm sure many colleagues in the room will know that the Central African Republic has had a difficult history of political instability and violence, and resulting in forced displacement. Since gaining independence in 1960, there have been as many as 7 coups d'etat in the Central African Republic. About 5 of these resulted in changes in power, and more recently, the outbreak of political military conflict in 2012 has meant that conflict remains elevated in the country. This is captured by the ACLED data that we are showing in the left-hand panel of these charts, which shows the sort of number of fatalities and the number of conflict-related events over time. But that's also seen in many other data sources as well, including data from UNHCR on protection monitoring and several other sources as well. And unsurprisingly, this has resulted in a great deal of forced displacement within the Central African Republic, which is what the graph on the right is showing since 2012. Displacement, has really followed the statistics on conflict, and what that means is now we have about 500,000 people who are internally displaced within the Central African Republic. In a country of around 6 million people, that means 10% of the population at least are displaced. And that doesn't even talk to the 700,000 refugees from CAR that are living in other countries, and doesn't even touch on the up to 2 million returnees that Central Africa has as well. So conflict and displacement have been on the up in this setting and remain at elevated levels. Despite these challenges, the Statistical Office in the Central African Republic, so the Institut Centrafricain des Statistiques et des Études économiques et sociales, or ECASES, was able to conduct a household living standard survey in 2021. That's the Enquête harmonisée sur les conditions de vie des ménages, or HCVM. And this, in many ways, follows some of the standard best practices for collecting information on consumption and on welfare that have been sort of set out across the sub-region, across Western and Central Africa. This was a survey conducted in 2 waves, in April and June 2021, and October and December 2021. So this enables us to account for seasonality in the results. This is a survey that includes very standard questions on monetary and non-monetary welfare, including like detailed information on households' consumption. So we can calculate standard consumption aggregates. We can calculate standard monetary welfare alongside a whole host of other non-monetary welfare metrics in line with international best practices. But perhaps the most sort of important aspect of this survey and what sets it apart from other surveys done in this kind of context is that the sampling strategy was able to integrate those living in IDP camps. And this was made possible by close collaboration between ECASES, who were implementing the survey, the World Bank, and UNHCR, who were able to provide detailed and up-to-date information on households that were living in IDP camps so that they could be part of the sample frame. As well as this, sort of following some of the guidelines from EGRIS and JDC and others, the questionnaire also gathered detailed information on people's displacement history, including where people were displaced from, when they were displaced, and their reasons for displacement, as well as a little bit on return intentions. And this enables us to do sort of 2 things. Firstly, we can identify those displaced people who are living outside of IDP camps. But sort of more importantly for this paper, we can figure out the places that IDPs came from originally, right down to the commune level, right down to the admin 3 level in the Central African Republic. So this sort of unique data set gives us a good platform to conduct the analysis that we want to do in this paper. Okay. So moving on to the methodology. Earlier we mentioned in the motivating kind of section that the main problem is it's really difficult to construct a counterfactual. It's really difficult to figure out what would have happened to displace people had they not been displaced, and we sort of need to know this if we want to properly assess the welfare effects of forced displacement well. We said that simply comparing displaced people and non-displaced people, while useful for policy, might be a little bit misleading when we're trying to construct this counterfactual and assess the welfare effects of forced displacement. And what we're going to focus on in this paper is the sort of first of the 2 reasons that make constructing this counterfactual difficult. So that means we're going to try and deal with the fact that the communities from which displaced people come are not a random selection of communities across the country. IDPs come from places that are affected by conflict, by natural disasters, and by other shocks. So how are we going to do this? Well, rather than comparing IDPs to the whole of the rest of the country, we're going to ask, well, what if we compare them to the places of origin? What if we try and compare them to the places that from which IDPs typically originate? And this is what we're calling catchment areas for IDP camps in the Central African Republic. How do we do this? Well, we use the displacement history data to write down the main prefecture, sous-prefecture, and communes from which IDPs originate in the Central African Republic. So the prefectures, that's the admin 1 level. There's about 20 of those in the Central African Republic. The sous-prefectures, like admin 2, so there's about 70 of those. And then the communes are the admin 3 level, and there's about 170 of those. And we're going to write down the specific areas which cover sort of which form the communities of origin for 90% of those people living in IDP camps, and that's how we construct these catchment areas. These catchment areas sort of represent what we believe to be a more valid comparison group when assessing the welfare of those living in IDP camps. And as I said, we can do this from multiple different administrative levels. What we focus on the analysis is the sous-prefecture level, because we find that when we focus on the commune level, it's too zoomed in and you don't get enough households in your comparison group, whereas if we focus on the prefecture level, those are too big. And that means we somewhat water down the sample with households that are really a long way away from the shocks the conflict that initially led people to be displaced. And this map on the right is just showing exactly that exercise. So the black dots are where the main IDP camps in our sample are located. And then the darker grey areas are showing the superprefecture that form these catchment areas, that form these places of origin for IDPs, and that we use as an alternative comparison group for our analysis. What do we actually do? Well, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to compare those living in camps with the full sample of all households across the rest of the country. That's step one. And then the second thing we're going to do is compare those living in camps just with those in the communities of origins, of just those in catchment areas. And that's what this regression here is capturing. We focus specifically on comparing those living in camps to those living outside of camps. Generally, so we don't focus on IDPs living in communities, although that work has been done previously in the Central African Republic. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a whole host of outcome variables, including consumption, monetary poverty, food security, and then, importantly, non-monetary poverty as well. There are certain things we can test as well to make sure that our results are not affected by the fact that people are living in camps. So, as I mentioned earlier, consumption and income measures can be distorted by humanitarian assistance. What we're able to do is, using the data, check whether gifted consumption, whether donated consumption to that household affects the results as well, given the level of detail in the survey. One thing the analysis does not do is take account of the household and individual level factors that could determine whether people move within those affected communities. There's lots of existing work that shows that assets and livelihoods, education, networks, and so on matter for whether people are displaced. And ideally, we'd love to be able to control for this when we assess the welfare effects of displacement. But it's really difficult to do this because so many of the individual and household level characteristics that we typically use as controls are affected by displacement itself. So they look much more like outcome variables than control variables. So, for example, if we look at, this table is just comparing some basic statistics on the household for those living in camps and those living in catchment areas. And, things that would typically be stable, conditions of the dwelling, the walls, the roof, and so on, are obviously very different in camps and outside of camps, even if we focus on the catchment areas. The same applies to household characteristics. We can see that displacement potentially affects the size of the household, the number of dependents, some characteristics of the household head, because when people are displaced, when households are displaced, they split, merge, change head, and so on. So, we can do some robustness checks and include these control variables in our regressions. It doesn't make too much difference to the results qualitatively, but we don't actually think this is valid because these variables look much more like outcomes. They're things that are affected by displacement rather than being suitable controls. Okay. Moving on to the results. So it's certainly true that monetary consumption, which is we're going to take as our main outcome variable for this particular paper, is lower in IDP camps than the rest of the Central African Republic. So that's what this first column is showing here. This is a regression of log of consumption on whether someone lives in the camp. And what we see is that, in that first column is that IDPs living in camps do have consumption levels that are about 24% lower than the general population, the general rest of the population in the Central African Republic, which is quite a big difference. And obviously this remains very important for policy, very important for targeting. We know that IDPs, compared to everyone else in the country, are worse off, and this gives us crucial information. However, let's look at what happens when we compare those living in IDP camps to those living in their places of origin, to those living in their catchment areas, and see what happens. And that's what the second column is showing. And what we see is a tenfold drop in the point estimate, and a coefficient that's no longer statistically significant. So in other words, we saw this big gap between IDPs living in camps and the rest of the country in terms of consumption. That gap seems to kind of go away when we restrict the comparison group just to those out-of-camp households that are living in the communities of origin, that are living in the catchment areas. And so this is kind of the key result of the paper. Doesn't seem to be affected by removing the gifted consumption, by removing the donated consumption. from the consumption aggregates. And so we don't think this is purely because the consumption aggregates that we're constructing in the Central African Republic are distorted by humanitarian assistance provided in camps or provided to IDPs elsewhere. We can also see this more clearly and perhaps visualize the difference more clearly, as well as testing whether this is just a fluke of the regressions by looking at the full distribution of consumption in those IDPs living in camps and those out-of-camp households. So on the left-hand side, we are comparing those living in camps again to the whole of the rest of the population. And yeah, we can see quite a big gap in the consumption levels here, those in-camp households, right across the distribution having lower consumption levels than the out-of-camp households. But if we then turn to the panel B, the panel on the right, if we compare those in-camp households just to those living in catchment areas, actually this difference right across the distribution appears to go away. So this is not just a fluke of the regressions. This is not just a fluke at the mean. This is something we see at the median, at all the percentiles of the consumption distribution. The gap that we previously saw when comparing in-camp and out-of-camp households for the whole country disappearing when we just focused the sample on in-camp households and their catchment areas. And sort of unsurprisingly, perhaps given the previous chart on the whole consumption distribution, what we see is, monetary poverty appears to be higher in camps than the whole of the rest of CAR, but the difference disappears when comparing to the catchment areas. So if we focus on the dark blue bars first, that's showing us food poverty. So that's telling us, what share of the population can afford a minimum basket that covers 2,300 calories per day. And that dark blue bar for the in-camp households is much higher than the rest of the Central African Republic. That's the middle dark blue bar, but it's actually about the same as that sample of catchment areas, that sample of communities of origin, which is what they're sort of carrying the red line across from the first bar to the third bar shows us. And we see something very similar, pretty much exactly the same, if we focus on overall poverty. So that's not just who can afford basic food needs, but who can afford their basic non-food needs too. Again, like those living in camps have sort of higher poverty levels, higher poverty rates than the rest of the population in the Central African Republic, but that difference disappears when we restrict the sample just to those catchment areas for the comparison group. One final result that I thought it would be important and helpful to show is that for non-monetary poverty, we see things that are slightly different. So let's turn to the kind of basic non-monetary poverty indicators that are often used in World Bank reports and elsewhere. And so we're going to focus on education and basic infrastructure. And what we have in this table is we're seeing the difference between camp and out-of-camp households for deprivation indicators for education enrollment, education attainment, and then the basic infrastructure. So basically, 1 here is poverty, is bad, is deprivation, and 0 is not. And so for education enrollment, attainment, and electricity, we see that that positive coefficient shows us that deprivation on those indicators is more likely for those living in camps than those living in the rest of the country. So that's a little bit following what we saw for monetary consumption and for monetary poverty. And again, qualitatively, we see that gap, if there is one, between those living in camps and the rest of the country kind of disappears when we focus, or gets smaller when we focus on the comparison between camp households and their catchment areas and the communities of origin. So education and electricity are sort of following what we saw for monetary poverty. What happens if we focus, however, on water and sanitation? Well, we actually see a slightly different story. So the negative coefficient for water in the first column,
you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, great. I'm nearly finished. The first column for water is showing that deprivation in camp-dwelling households is less likely than the rest of the Central African Republic by about 14 percentage points. So this in it is already showing us that actually there's certain services that may be easier to provide for people in IDP camps than it is to provide for the rest of the population. And what we see in this case is actually that gap that makes it look like improved water access is better in camps than the rest of the population is actually even wider if we compare those living in IDP camps with their catchment areas, so with their communities of origin. So, like, what do we see here for water and sanitation? You know, it's difficult to provide essential services outside of camps, and potentially more difficult than providing it within camps. But it's especially difficult to provide them in communities that were originally affected by shocks, natural disasters, and in particular conflict, as we see in the Central African Republic. Okay. So just moving on to the discussion, just have one slide to wrap up and talk through the policy and data implications. I mean, I think the sort of main message from a policy perspective for this particular paper is that certainly poverty reducing interventions should consider carefully IDPs, and we should continue the strong efforts to collect data on IDPs and displaced people at large. That comes out very clearly. But we also need to think about those people and those households that are in communities of origin, that are in the places where displaced people originate, from which displaced people originate as well. Those places that are originally affected by conflict, by natural disasters, and by potentially other shocks. And not only that, those communities may be even harder than the rest of the country to reach in terms of key services like water and sanitation. So, you know, certainly focus on IDPs, certainly focus on displacement, but don't forget those people that were left behind as well. What does that mean in terms of data collection? Analysis? Well, we think that data collection needs to be adapted to make sure it considers those in the communities left behind, those communities originally affected by conflict as well. And we sort of have three ideas for this. One would be, you know, a little bit like we did in this paper, sort of a two-step sampling approach. Perhaps you interview IDPs and displaced people first, and then you use the information on their displacement histories to find out from where they were displaced, isolate those communities, and oversample them in additional data collection work in order to find out about the people left behind. If we, like the sort of second point here, like if we had like the perfect world, we would collect longitudinal data that enables us to track people before, during, and after their displacement, and that would really give us detailed information on displacement histories and really enable us to figure out the welfare effects of forced displacement more directly. But if we can't do that, then at least getting some recalled data on households' pre-displacement characteristics would be something that could improve a little bit on what we've done in the paper. So as I mentioned, we've been able to sort of think about community level selection. If we had a little bit more recalled data, perhaps we could deal with household and individual level selection into displacement as well. Of course, recalled data comes with challenges, but it would at least be a start. And that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I hope that was clear. Looking forward to some questions. Over.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for an interesting presentation. I hope Chris is ready now. So he will be presenting on refugee return and conflict, evidence from a natural experiment.
You all hear and see my screen?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear. Go ahead.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. Sorry for the technical glitch earlier. I'm excited to be presenting here work on refugee repatriation and conflict with some great co-authors, Benjamin Crick at Duke and Austin Wright at UChicago. So there's 44 million people displaced across international borders around the world today. And, you know, I probably don't need to tell this room, but identifying solutions for these individuals is one of the kind of paramount humanitarian problems in the world today. And unfortunately, looking around at access to the so-called durable solutions for refugees, we see today that displacement is significantly outpacing refugee access to solutions. And when I say solutions, I mean one of three things: refugees repatriating back to their origin country when safe and dignified return is possible, refugees naturalizing and permanently integrating into a host country, or refugees being resettled in a safe third country. And the plots here show the global share of the world's refugees accessing any one of these solutions in any given year. And as you might notice, in the past decade, fewer than 4% of all refugees have accessed any one of these solutions. Now, refugee repatriation or return is the international community's kind of preferred solution for refugees. And in the ideal setting, we see safe and dignified repatriation become possible when conflicts and political instability end in refugees' origin countries. So a kind of classical case in point here is Mozambique, where the civil war ends in 1992, and then a huge wave of refugees returns in the subsequent 2 years. And again, Mozambique still a bit unstable in the immediate post-Civil War period, but generally returns are happening as a result of this improvement in conditions in the origin country. That's not necessarily the case for all or even most of the world's returnees. Let's consider Ukraine for a moment, right? In 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, millions of people flee, but subsequently, more than 2 million Ukrainians have actually returned to Ukraine, including 500,000 in 2023, despite the fact that ongoing hostilities continue quite intensively. And looking around the world, this is kind of a broader global phenomenon. 76% of all refugee returnees in the past 2.5 decades or so have actually ended up repatriating to an origin country that's still suffering significant ongoing hostilities. And so in this project, what our team of authors aims to do is to kind of map out a typology of these situations in which mass repatriation occurs, and then understand how the context within which repatriation is occurring shapes the consequences of refugee return in the communities to which people are repatriated. And so, as I mentioned, the kind of first dimension of this typology is the ideal typical case where refugees are returning because of improving opportunities in their origin country, either a significant improvement in security because the civil war ends, or something like an economic boom. And because this is the sort of ideal typical case, it's received the most attention in the extant literature. But we also identify two other contexts within which significant returns have occurred. One is this setting when there's a sort of exogenous reduction in the costs of return because of an aid or information program that helps to facilitate repatriation. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some evidence from a Pakistani-led program in 2016 that saw cash grants paid to returnees. That's an example of what we mean in this context. And then the third context, as I mentioned, the modal context right now is that returns happen not because of a real improvement in conditions in an origin country, but simply because of worsening conditions in host countries. These could be worsening conditions because of anti-refugee xenophobia and hostility, or policy restriction targeting refugee rights, or it could be because of something like a recession in a host country that just craters the economy. And in this paper, we're interested in mapping on how the consequences of refugee return in origin communities are actually shaped in important ways by the context within which repatriation occurs. And the key explanatory role here is played by economic and social endowments, which are shaped by repatriation context, and also play an important role in the prospects of refugee reintegration at the moment of return. And so thinking about economic endowments, these could be things like access to credit or refugees' broader financial situation, which clearly plays a role in their reintegration prospects. And again, if conditions are improving in origin, refugees are likely to have better financial prospects. Likewise, for those settings when refugees are returning because of an aid program. In contrast, if refugees are returning because of worsening conditions in a host country, say because of an economic recession, the economic endowment that returnees have is likely to be lower. Similarly, we can focus on social endowments, things like social capital, networks, and the psychosocial consequences of displacement. And again, we think that in contexts where worsening conditions in a host country drive mass return, social endowments are likely to be lower. This leads us to this kind of core prediction, which is that return that results because of worsening conditions in host countries rather than improving conditions in origin countries is likely to be associated with increasing fragility and conflict in the origin communities to which returnees are repatriating. So I'm just going to briefly mention the kind of series of projects that we're working on here before focusing on one in particular. But first, I mentioned we have studied this cash grant program implemented in Pakistan for Afghan refugees in 2016. This is a kind of paradigmatic program that falls under that exogenous reduction in mobility costs context that I mentioned earlier. So the cash assistance grant for returnees is doubled in the spring and summer of 2016. And what we see in consequence is about 500,000 people take up the cash grant and return back to Afghanistan. And there, the people who come home with cash assistance, despite the fact that violence is quite prevalent in Afghanistan at this time, are not associated with an increase in insurgent violence, as you might expect. Actually, insurgent violence is declining. And we have suggestive evidence that this occurs because the positive externalities or spillovers of this aid program improve living conditions for both migrants and their non-migrant neighbors. Now, although we do see this reduction in insurgent violence, there is an increase in communal violence, and so that's important to note as well. For the remainder of today, though, I'm going to focus on the second project that we're working on, which looks at returns induced by a sanction levied on Iran by the United States in 2018. And this is a context where return happens simply because of worsening conditions in a host country, right? So the Trump administration pulls out from the Iran nuclear deal in the spring of 2018 and reimposes US sanctions on the Iranian nuclear program. The consequence of these sanctions is to cause a massive currency devaluation in Iran that's disproportionately harmful to Afghan migrants. In response, about 700,000 Afghans end up returning home to Afghanistan. And this is all happening at the start of the 2018 fighting season in Afghanistan, when the Taliban is interested in recruiting a large pool of kind of part-time fighters to facilitate its summer offensive. And we're going to draw on some unique data here, as well as surveys, to understand how these returns affect the trajectory of the conflict in Afghanistan. What we show in the project is that the sanctions reduce refugee livelihoods, lead to large-scale returns, worsen insurgent violence, and I'll get to the mechanism here in just a moment, but we find, again, some suggestive evidence that returnees who are coming home impoverished and destitute are actually pretty vulnerable to Taliban recruitment simply through this kind of opportunity cost wage channel. And in this context, we don't see an increase in communal violence. So an increase in insurgent, but not social conflict. All right, let me just briefly explain the context a bit more. Afghans currently comprise the largest refugee population in the world. More than 25% of all Afghans have been displaced abroad at some point. And in 2018, the year we study here, there's about 3 million Afghans residing in Iran, which is the 6th largest global host country. And as I mentioned, the returns that we study are induced by these so-called maximum pressure sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. And so in April and May, it becomes clear that the Trump administration is going to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Immediately, we see currency markets start to move, currency begin to devalue in Iran, even before the full-scale reinstatement of the sanctions. So from the moment Trump announces that the US is going to pull out of the deal, the reimposition of sanctions is kind of assumed by the market. What we see is a significant spike in inflation, about a 62% increase in inflation, a drop in Iranian oil production, and a broader drop in the Iranian GDP, amounting to about $153 billion reduction, right? So the sanctions are significant on Iran. We know this as well from both the testimony of officials in the US Defense Department who pointed out prior to the policy the likely consequence on refugee returns. And we can also validate this with some survey-based measures from the labor force and income surveys in Iran, where we see that the sanctions are increasing unemployment and decreasing income, wage rate, and hours worked of Afghan migrants based in Iran. Looking at the kind of time series of returns of Afghans from Iran during the sanctions period that we study, the level of return increases to about 160% of the mean level of return in the prior 3 years. So a significant return shock. And importantly, we have survey evidence from a survey of these returnees where they attribute their return to the negative economic conditions in Iran. Afghan officials also noted this simple fact. In border monitoring, they said simply, it's easy, more sanctions on Iran equals more returnees. So this is the context that we're studying here. We have a variety of really unique data sources, including some confidential data shared by NATO on the universe of insurgent violence in Afghanistan. To back out communal conflict, we use both survey-based measures and a proprietary US government tracker. And then finally, we also have a set of attitudinal results from a NATO commissioned survey in Afghanistan at the time. To understand patterns of repatriation in 2018, we draw on historical data from the IOM to map the kind of settlement patterns between of Afghan returnees from Iran between 2012 and 2015. And the idea here, this is common in the migration literature, is that the returnees coming back in 2018 are highly likely to follow the geographic precedent of the returnees in earlier waves. And so indeed, this is the kind of returns in 2012 to 2015 that we leverage, but looks highly similar in the actual program period in 2018. And so there's a high correlation here. And what we can do is leverage the cross-sectional or geographic exposure in Afghanistan on the basis of those historical settlement patterns in tandem with this kind of temporal shock posed by the reimposition of the sanctions to compare before and after the sanctions are induced, the trends in conflict in highly or less impacted districts as far as the return shock goes. And importantly, we don't see evidence that violence is increasing in the communities that are highly exposed to these returnees prior to the onset of the sanctions program. Okay, so just going to give you the core results here. First, focused on insurgent violence. What we see both on the extensive margin and in per capita levels is that a 1 standard deviation increase in exposure to the returnees from Iran during the sanctions program is associated with an increase in insurgent-initiated violence. On the extensive margin, this is about a 1.5 percentage point increase. In levels, something like 1.5 attacks per 100,000 of population. So more than a full additional insurgent attack per district month. We can also see kind of corresponding evidence, as I mentioned, in a survey fielded contemporaneously, in which we see it's not just that behavioral result, but perceptions of security are also declining in these highly impacted communities in Afghanistan, the places most exposed to the return of refugees from Iran. And more importantly, perhaps, right, we might be worried that historical returnee settlement patterns are endogenous to conflict in a way that could contaminate the results. But we can also just leverage the simple proximity between a district and the border crossings that Iranian returnees were using to get back into Afghanistan, with the idea being that people stay relatively close to the border crossing that they actually come through. And again, here we can see substantively similar results in increase in insurgent violence in the highly impacted communities. Now, to understand why this happens, we consider two possible mechanisms. The first is this kind of classical opportunity cost story, where because these refugee returnees are coming back destitute, they've had their cash savings wiped out by currency devaluation in Iran, they're going to be relatively vulnerable to Taliban recruitment. And the Taliban is interested in recruiting a large pool, as I mentioned, of part-time fighters to assist in the summer offensive in the period of time in which returnees are coming back. A second possibility, a bit harder to test, is that Iran seeks to retaliate against US forces in Afghanistan for the US imposed sanctions on Iran. They could do this, for instance, by giving covert support and arms to Taliban factions, leveraging the kind of instability posed by the large-scale returns to kind of increase logistical supplies to Taliban factions. Again, a bit harder to measure where Iranian covert support is operating in Afghanistan, but we don't find much suggestive evidence for that channel. We're going to focus primarily on this opportunity cost channel. So two pieces of evidence make us think that this is largely what's responsible for the increase in insurgent violence. First, in the surveys that we have, we can see that in places heavily impacted by the return shock in 2018, perceptions of the economy are declining, in particular, reductions in reported full-time employment, satisfaction with the labor market, and food security, right? So economic conditions are worsening in the communities to which returnees are repatriating. We can also look at the tactics of insurgent violence, so the means by which the Taliban perpetrates attacks. And we can characterize some of these tactics as relatively more labor intensive, right? It takes a larger team of recruits to pull off a direct fire confrontation with the government, and indeed consistent with a kind of a shift in the composition of insurgent attacks attributable to this increase in recruits that the Taliban has at their disposal. We see that most of the increase in insurgent violence is coming from substitution into these sort of labor-intensive forms of violence that you can only pull off with larger teams of recruits. So again, suggestive evidence for this opportunity cost mechanism. Finally, turning to communal violence, we can look at the survey-based evidence here, which is our primary means of studying communal violence, although we have this additional behavioral measure that yields substantively similar results. And what we see is that returnees actually don't report worse relations with their neighbors. If anything, they're actually less likely to report experiencing communal disputes. So this defies all of our expectations and the finding from that 2016 paper I mentioned, where we saw that communal violence was increasing in the areas impacted by refugee returns. So understanding this specific finding is a kind of priority for the future, and keen to hear your thoughts on this. One thing I will note, though, is that this effect is heterogeneous by local institutions. And so in the places highly exposed to refugee returnees, where people report that they have more trust and reliance on the kind of informal community level dispute adjudication institutions like Shura councils that exist, we can see that those are kind of offsetting the effect of return on communal relations. And so, people returning to areas with weak dispute resolution institutions actually report a greater exposure to communal disputes, but those in areas with stronger local institutions are reporting less experiences of communal violence, less experiences of a negative relationship with their neighbors. So Some interesting results there, obviously suggestive, and don't want to place a causal interpretation on this, but we think it potentially suggests some important policy implications about supporting communal institutions in the communities to which returnees are repatriating. So in conclusion, we have plausibly causal evidence here of the consequences of refugee repatriation in a novel context where return occurs because of worsening conditions in a host country and not improving conditions in an origin country. We show that return affects different types of political and social violence, so insurgent versus communal violence, in different ways, in a way that hasn't really been appreciated enough in extant literature. That sanctions, an important foreign policy tool, can both induce repatriation and carry negative externalities for populations outside the target country, Iran in this case. And then finally, we think that this offers a nice foundation for future research in which others can come along, kind of take the typology of return settings that we've identified here and look at other social outcomes, kind of consequences on internal displacement or re-displacement of the people that go back to conflict-affected areas. And so we think that this is a kind of exciting start of a broader agenda. Thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think this is very insightful, and I'm just thinking, on the policy perspective to the South Sudan case, where we have all these South Sudanese returning from Sudan to their origin communities. So yeah, very interesting and worrying also regarding your results. So thank you to all the three presenters. I would like to collect some questions now. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, 5. Okay, we're going. Okay, we'll take 4 questions now, and then we'll go for a second round. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the presenters. This has been extremely insightful. So I've learned a lot in this panel. I have a question for the first panelist, for Omar, and it might have been that I didn't fully understand the identification strategies that you use in your paper. And so I was interested to understand a bit better, how do you account to the fact that the migrants that left Venezuela early, which tend to be more educated, more resourceful, are different from those that leave later. And so we have, there's irregularity, but also there's like kind of different people, right? But more than that, if you think about the irregularity, it might have affected also the composition of those that would have, that came to Venezuela from Venezuela to Peru to begin with, right? It might be that the type of people that even came after June 2019 is different from those that would have come without the change in policy. So it's, the question is, how do you disentangle the effect of the policy from the fact that we have a different composition because of that policy? So I'm really interested in your thoughts about those thorny questions.
Thanks to the whole panel. This was fascinating. My question actually very related to what Guy was saying, also to Omar. So wondering if there's like administrative data on just the number of even just regular migrants or total migrants to see if like levels decreased right at that same time of the cutoff. And then to Guy's point about composition, whether you could just test those effects just in terms of the descriptives within the data. I think you're controlling for them, but those being sort of outcomes as an initial step, I think would be really interesting if you're not already doing it.
Hi, thank you for the presenters. So I have a question for Christopher. I'm Laura from the University of Exeter in the UK. Really interesting, thank you. So my question was, you could deep into the question on who is driven these effects? Shall we expect that are the Afghans that were already there, or are the returnees? If you could normalize your treatment with the population already there. And in particular, my question is, can you show some heterogeneity connected with human capital accumulation, right? Some variation depending on well-educated versus low-educated, and also with, do you observe some changes in social norms for the Afghans that were returnees before arriving or before coming back to Afghanistan? So that would be interesting as well to see and answer this question on who is driven these effects. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We also have an online question, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank all our online participants that were very lively today. So it's a question from Taye Dida to Jonathan, asking whether returnees were included among those left behind, and in case whether how this affected your results. Thank you.
Great. Maybe Omar, you can start. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. No, thank you so much for the questions. I really, really appreciate them. So in terms of the self-selection of migrants, of course, this is a concern that is raised very often. If we compare the individuals who arrive slightly before, slightly after, we do a series of tests, of course, a covariate balance analysis. So we see that actually when you look at the absolute composition, and this is actually true not only for this data set, but for the data set that I used in a publication also that came out recently, we don't see on observables any difference. Of course, there could be differences in terms of the composition based on unobservables, but that doesn't seem to be, but it's difficult to test that, of course. In terms of, so that's on your first point. In terms of the second question relating to administrative data. So we asked the Interior Ministry of Peru for regular entry data of Venezuelans over that period, and we do see that there is a huge plunge in regular entries over that period of time. So if you look only at that data, the data that the government has, it suggests that they were very successful in deterring migrants. However, on the other hand, if you look at the survey data, there's an increase in the likelihood of entry. That suggests that the probably, we cannot exclude some form of deterrence, as I've mentioned earlier, but indeed, it is the case that the likelihood increased, but we can't be absolutely sure of the absolute levels. We now have an ongoing discussion with the Interior Ministry in Peru to get administrative data, and we're trying to understand exactly, how did the composition change. But surprisingly, very surprisingly for us, we didn't see big changes. And talking to, for instance, organizations that of Venezuelan migrants, they told us that, for instance, when the restrictions were introduced, one thing that happened was simply that, and that was really surprising for us. They said the police would just look the other way. You could just cross. You didn't even have to go through the trocha, to the very dangerous routes as we imagine. The Darien Gap crossing. Literally, they would just stop looking at people. Even when they sent the army and they sent even tanks at some point, they said the police would just go the other side and people would just walk through, because of course they knew that it wasn't. They were not able to, even if they stopped them there at the bridge, they would be able to cross on the sides, as it's known, very common, for instance, at the border between Venezuela and Colombia, just to give you another example. But so we did this survey to understand exactly how the experience of migrating changed, and whether the expectations about what people would find at the border changed, and that hopefully will allow us to understand whether we're missing something in terms of the composition of migrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question for Christopher. Yeah, third question.
Yes, thank you very much. Excellent question. I think it's very difficult, given the data that we have, to disentangle whether whether this is happening because returnees themselves are being mobilized or whether it's because of mobilization of non-migrant neighbors in return impacted communities. I think the truthful answer is probably that it's a bit of both, and that's consistent with our qualitative understanding. But it's quite difficult to disentangle those two channels. I'll have to look back at some of the survey evidence we have and see if there's a specific question about kind of like willingness to participate among the survey of returnees to participate in kind of anti-government violence. And then love the idea to kind of leverage human capital accumulation in the host country as a source of heterogeneity. I think we should definitely be able to do that, at least in some of the survey-based analyses, because we observe education and related outcomes. And so great suggestion, and stay tuned for an answer on what we find there. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. And the last question was for Jonathan. Yeah, and then we'll go for another round.
Thank you very much for the questions. Super. We need to the kind of things that we want to do next with this work. So did we include returnees in the left behind? As far as you know, yes. We haven't made any efforts to separate out the returnees from the comparison group. So does it affect our results? We don't know, but this is something that we could check, and I think we should try and do. We should try and implement that check later. One thing we have looked at is if you separate out what you might call kind of the IDP households outside of camps. And so what that means is those households that are hosting IDPs that live outside of camps, what happens when you compare to them? Actually, they tend to look like the rest of the population in many respects. So they tend to look a little bit like households that don't host any IDPs as well. So really you have a big difference between those IDPs living in camps and the rest of the population who don't host any IDPs, but the difference between households hosting IDPs and households not hosting IDPs outside of camps don't tend to be as big. But you could do this, and I think I'd advertise that these data will eventually come out, and there's a huge module on forced displacement and displacement histories that's included there. That could really help to get at some of the questions that were being asked by Tai. You'd have to think about how to construct this at the household level if you wanted to do household level analysis. So one challenge we sort of face with this work is that displacement is in some sense an individual level construct, but poverty and consumption, at least as measured by the World Bank standard, is a household level construct. But you can sort of find ways to do this, and so I think it would be great to explore what happens when you use information on returnees as well as IDPs when constructing the comparison groups for this analysis. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. I saw, there's one here, and a Maria, and yeah. Can we have the mic? Or... Here, right here.
Very interesting presentations. I have a question for Jonathan. So you use the catchment areas as a control group for the treatment of being IDPs, but in a way these catchment areas can be thought of as the treatment group for whatever causes displacement. And so it seems to me like you're comparing your IDPs to a moving target. And the fact that you don't detect a difference, because the IDPs are not supposedly impacted by the conflict that causes displacement, while those left behind are. So am I thinking the right way? I wanted to raise this point.
So I have one question for Chris, which relates a little bit of the question asked before. It's unclear to me whether the impact you are seeing is due to returns or to the income effect due to the decrease in remittances or income, more generally speaking. And that's very true for the entire, I think, research question, which is if situations in the host country deteriorate, is it a cash effect or is it a human capital effect due to the return? I think that's a critically important question to get at, because policy-wise, if it's just cash, then we can offset the cash decrease with cash transfers otherwise. If it's a return of people, then it's a whole different policy question. And then one suggestion for Jonathan, I think to me at least, there's a debate of whether we should care about IDPs independently of vulnerability. It would be very interesting, I think, if you push your analysis to say, is IDPs in the case of Central African Republic a marker of vulnerability? Shall we prioritize IDPs over widows and orphans? Why do we have that independent category, which is completely understandable when we talk about refugees, but once we are in the confine of a territory, then this translation from refugees to IDPs doesn't seem to be as normatively straightforward.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking this panel. I think all three of you are working on really important topics with difficult data to navigate. So I really enjoyed hearing about your work. I do have a specific question for Jonathan. And again, it gets back to the data challenges. You mentioned, Jonathan, that ideally we have a longitudinal panel where we can actually better understand what conditions are like before people are displaced. But of course, we don't necessarily have that in this case. I'm wondering if you have any sense in general, though, in this context, who may be more likely to leave and who may be more likely to stay. Is there anything you can infer from the data you have available that can help add that additional nuance that may provide maybe a bit more credibility to comparing to the catchment areas? Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more for Omar about your results on remittances that I find quite counterintuitive. And if you could elaborate more a bit on that, because one would expect that if you're an irregular migrant, you don't have labor permit, and then you would tend to earn less and then be able to remit less, but you find the opposite. So yeah, I'd like to hear if you have any explanation for that. Yeah, maybe we can start with Jonathan. There were 3 questions for you, and then Chris and Omar. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much again for the questions. These are really kind of getting to the heart of what's, I think, difficult working with these data. So I very much appreciate them. I think that the way they're framed is touching on things that we've thought about and perhaps not done the analysis to address so far. So on the first question on whether the catchment areas, the communities of origin, are the treatment group, so basically yes. I think the answer is yes. We treat them as the comparison group here because we're trying to find a reasonable sort of test for whether we can assess IDPs' welfare or the impacts of displacement on welfare. But in a sense, there's like 3 groups in play. Like there's the IDPs. There's the comparison group, like the ones we construct with the catchment area, and then there's the rest of the population. So I think, like going forward, what we could think about is doing kind of a 3-way comparison between these 3 groups to see what the results are there. And you're absolutely right. There's in a sense this feeds into like a broader agenda on figuring out what the effects of shocks are on households. So that point is well taken. I think that's something that we need to think about how we do that 3-way comparison in future iterations of this work. On the second question about sort of why should we care about IDPs, and maybe it's like slightly different in the case of refugees. Again, I think this is also a little bit what we're trying to sort of show in this paper. So in some sense, there's a kind of big literature showing that the welfare outcomes of IDPs are worse than many other communities. But we're trying to focus specifically on that comparison between IDPs and their communities of origin. And maybe, like the sort of first question was saying, maybe it's those communities of origin. Maybe that's the sort of better marker of trying to identify households that are more vulnerable. I think one thing we could do with this is we could almost think about, like, in a sense, we're trying to construct some kind of proxy means test for targeting. And maybe IDPs is one of the variables that should be going in that proxy means test. Maybe it isn't. So one thing we could do is actually compare this to other household characteristics and see how much of the differences in welfare are potentially explained by someone living in a camp or someone not living in a camp. On the third question, yeah. So this is I think sort of a very important question about, you know, whether we can do anything to kind of control for individual and household level characteristics. There's certainly work on this that looks at, like, assets, education, people's networks, and shows that, you know, these household characteristics matter for whether or not people move. It's really difficult to do in this context because we need to observe those things, like, before displacement happened, and we just don't do that with the data that we have for the USCBM 2021. Which is a little bit what I was saying, like, one tiny tweak would just be to get a little bit of recall data so we know what households' situation was like before they were displaced. I suppose one thing we could do is try and merge this with geospatial data sources on conflict and, you know, maybe assets back before displacement took place, and that's something we should maybe think about doing. But from the data itself that we have, I think it's difficult to do, and that's a little bit why we make the recommendations about data collection that we do. Over.
Yeah, thank you for the question about remittances. It's a great one and one that we've grappled with a bit. So we have pre-treatment measures of reliance on remittances and specifically from Iran in these surveys that we have access to, and so we can control for, you know, pre-treatment remittance reliance. The effect holds. We can look for heterogeneity by, you know, high or low reliance on remittances. We don't see much evidence of heterogeneity on that dimension. So I think it is more about the returnees than the fact that the remittances get cut off when the sanctions devalue the Iranian currency. But this is something that it's tough to grapple with. And you're right, you know, from a programmatic, like, policy perspective, it's super important to understand that side of the coin. I mentioned the 2016 Pakistan cash return paper that we've worked on, and there, you know, I think that the sanguine news is that in that context, cash aid does help undercut the effect on insurgent conflict, and so potentially useful to roll out here, with the caveat being that it's you know, I think program design matters a lot, and you risk potentially inflaming communal violence if the cash grant is perceived as parochially benefiting returnees or refugees and not the stayees or their non-migrant neighbors of returnees. And, you know, I think that's an important area where more work is needed to fully flesh out, like, a potential jealousy backlash effect around cash assistance in these settings. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you so much for the question. Again, also on remittances. So it was surprising for us, of course, to find that falling into irregularity led to quite a sharp increase in the likelihood of sending remittances back home for Venezuelan migrants. We have two working hypotheses that we actually are going to test in the survey that we'll administer next week. One hypothesis that and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. One is probably that sending, because you are in an irregular situation and you don't have, for instance, access to banking, you don't really have a way to safely store the actual money that you have, right? You don't have access to a bank account. And so the best way maybe to save resources and avoid, for instance, being robbed, etc., might be just to send it home. But another hypothesis that we have, and I think it complements the first one, is that probably because you are in a situation of irregularity, you're less likely to think that you're going to stay in the country over the long term. And so instead of using that money and investing it in the country where you are at the moment, you instead prefer to send it back home because maybe you're more likely to think that at some point you will leave. However, these are just working hypotheses. We will know more, I hope, once we get the results of the survey back. Thank you.
Thank you so very much to the three presenters. Please join me in thanking them. Really, I think this was very, very fascinating, and there were lots of questions for you. So I thank you all for your attention, and then I think now it's time for lunch. And sorry to the presenters. You made great presentation, but no lunch for you. Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone.
Please be back in the room at 1:30. Thank you. For those online, we'll be back at 1:30 Abidjan time. Thanks.